All right, hello. My name is Richard. This is Shimon and Pavel, and we are solving the challenge regarding sustainable mobility for inhabitants and understanding the needs of residents by CityA. So without further ado, I would like to show you our solution, which we have called Noisewise. So first off, let's talk a little bit about the challenge that we've been given. CityA is a company that provides alternative mobility solutions, especially in rural areas. And they are looking for an innovative way to collect data on resident mobility. They want us to consider a variety of data sources, including surveys, mobile apps, smart sensors, and other technologies, and find ways to combine and analyze these data sources to generate insights and inform decision making. We have decided to look at one sort of smaller subset of this challenge, and that is to see if we can find a way to predict demand for sustainable mobility in rural areas. So to predict demand, we decided that the easiest way is to compare demand for mobility in general and then compare it to availability of sustainable options. And we know that the data on sustainable mobility is already out there. We can find out, when buses come. There's open data sets through things like GTFS. You can find bike lanes and other such things on OpenStreetMaps. However, what's much more difficult is finding out when people want to go somewhere. So, in simpler terms, if we can determine that someone took a car when there was no bus or other sustainable alternative available, we can assume that there's a higher likelihood that there would be demand for an alternative solution such as CityA. So, we have looked at several options on how to do this. First off, we were thinking about, what if we run a survey? But people don't really like, filling out surveys, especially on things like, where have you gone today or where do you want to go? We were looking at finding ways to track people via apps or other services in their mobile phones, but this is a nightmare when it comes to personal data protection and, in general, public relations isn't very great for a company that wants to track you everywhere you go. So we have decided that we can track this through a more indirect method. If we measure the flow of personal vehicles between municipalities, we should be able to, in general, be able to see and possibly even predict demand for mobility between municipalities in certain areas. It's not a perfect metric. However, we feel that such a metric could be useful in addition to other data sources. So, how can this data be obtained? So there are, again, many alternatives. However, many of these do have drawbacks. We can try to collect data from companies that already track this, such as Google or Waze or TomTom, other GPS providers. However, the issue here is that these mostly look for data on congestion rather than traffic flow. They aren't all that useful outside of cities because while they do track you, they'll only tell you, if there is if there's congestion on a road. They won't really tell you, this many vehicles have passed between two municipalities. Plus, this data is difficult to obtain because either they don't share it or they charge a pretty hefty price for it. We're also looking at getting data through other indirect ways, such as using satellites, satellite imagery, or collecting GSM data, phone data. But this has a tendency to be extremely expensive, especially if you want to compare data over a long term. Or we are looking through other public data sources, such as cities that collect data or surveys. We have found that while these sources do exist, they're almost non-existent outside of large urban areas, and they oftentimes are short-term surveys that won't give you real-time or up-to-date data. Then we decided that we should focus on smart sensors. We looked at the existing competition out there, such as traffic cameras, inductive sensors inside roads, magnetometers embedded into roads, which would count the amount of cars driving across a certain road. We have noticed that these have several drawbacks as well. Usually, they require modification to the road or extra infrastructure to be able to operate. And they are most of the time optimized for cities or highways, places with very high traffic flow, which would not be ideal if we're trying to count somewhere in a rural area where maybe just a couple hundred cars pass throughout the day. Therefore, we have decided that the only real solution that we see is to create our own brand new data source through a smart sensor, which has the following following design goals. It must be low cost, it must be easy to deploy, it must have very low infrastructure requirements, it doesn't require roadwork or any kind of intrusive modification to existing infrastructure, and it is optimized to collect the amount of personal vehicles that pass through a certain area. Our proposed solution is, well, this box over here, or at least this is our prototype so far, which is a wireless, solar-powered smart sensor that detects and classifies vehicle types using traffic noise levels. So here's a basic technical overview of how it works. For our prototype, we have installed a, Raspberry Pi, which is a single board computer, attached 2 microphones to it, attached a solar panel so that it can operate off-grid, and through a GSM module, it will then communicate to a server where it will collect data. The software looks like this. We take information from 2 microphones, run it through a bunch of audio processing over here. We determine which direction the vehicles are moving along the road. Then we pass that into a neural network, which should ideally classify what type of vehicle it is so that we can filter out commercial traffic from passenger traffic. Send that over to a cloud database, and that will then aggregate the types of vehicles that are passing through. Then ideally, we either visualize it through a heat map or provide it as a public API. So this is a little sort of concept visualization that we created. Here's what it looked like when we were testing it in the field. So as you can see on the outside, you can see the solar panel. We've got a GSM antenna on the inside, and of course we can show you the internals later. The output from this box would be a, well, each individual sensor would detect, whenever a vehicle passes it, it would detect what type of vehicle and the direction of travel. This is then aggregated. We can place these sensors around all the main roads that are leading in and out of municipalities, collect the total inflow and outflow of cars from each municipality, and thus we can more or less determine where people are moving to throughout the day and where they want to move to. This aggregated data can, as I said, be made public via APIs or a graphic visualization. So here's a sort of quick overview of what visual overview of how that data would look like. So each of the bars that you can see would be the total amount of inflow or outflow, the blue bars being a negative number, and the green, orange, and red ones being various levels of inflow of cars into that area throughout the day. And the arrows would show from which areas vehicles are moving to. We've done a short cost analysis on our prototype. So this is just the pure bill of material, so just the cost of the components itself. We came to a price of 3,000 crowns for a prototype. However, we are using hobbyist components, which are relatively expensive because they have a lot of capability that is not required for the sensor. So if we were to create a production version of this sensor, we believe that we could drive the cost down by about 50%, if not more. Of course, there would be extra overhead for software development and so on, but that cost would go down with the production volume. So what next? How would the sensor actually be deployed? We believe that the sensor can be deployed commercially, so a company could provide this to municipalities for a cost, or it could be used as a part of a public-private partnership where a municipality, which also would be able to use this data for various purposes, would coordinate with a private company that would manufacture these and hopefully co-fund it with public funds. Speaking of which, there are also possible subsidies in this area because there are many EU directives that are currently focusing on integrated traffic solutions and so on, which are part of the EU Green Deal and so forth. And it's also in line with national digitalization goals. And so the next step would be to finalize and advance from a prototype into a production design to see if this could actually be a viable solution. So yeah, in conclusion, we have designed a solution to collect data on passenger mobility. We've developed a rapid prototype, and we've prepared a possible business plan for real-world deployment. So yeah, hopefully this is interesting solution for you. And yeah, thank you for your attention. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much. Mr. Schaefer, you have the privilege to ask the first question.
I would like to thank you. I have many questions, but you answered most of those. So thank you for that. Maybe when are you preparing the first prototype?
So right now we have a semi-functional prototype. Unfortunately, because of the time constraints, we haven't been able to train a full machine learning model yet. We didn't have enough time to collect data or label it. And plus, the audio processing can be a bit difficult, but it's something that we can work on. Yeah, we've got the components together. We've got parts of the software ready. So I don't know how long it would take us, but yeah, with a good development team, I think a couple of months of work, something could happen.
Yeah, I always like this phrase, a couple of months, and then, then we go into business.
Maybe you might have to double it, depends on how lazy the programmers are. But
sounds like these famous last words. Yes, please.
Do you maybe have an estimation of the useful life?
It depends on the exact use case of how it would be deployed, because these could either be used for short-term surveys where they're just placed along roads for a couple of months to get a large data set, or they could be used permanently as a real-time data source. It really would depend on the final design. Right? Even right now in our prototype, we are using basically a commercially available box that's used for outdoor electronics. It's got IP66 rating, so it's relatively well protected from the environment. So in the end, it really would depend on battery life. It does have a solar panel, so it is being constantly charged, which could impact battery life over time. There would have to be more modeling done on that, but we estimate that it could survive years or more. There are existing sensors that use different methods, which are used in cities, which advertise up to 10 years of service life. So something along those lines, possibly even.
And what kind of connectivity do you use?
GSM, 2G, GPRS. The idea there is that we don't use ultra high power, high bandwidth networks. We don't really need a high, because all the processing is done on the edge. It's done on the device itself. So we only really need to send the statistics over a certain period, so we don't need a high-speed data connection. We just need something that's available everywhere and easy to connect to.
I'm more thinking if there was a bad connection, if it kind of influences the battery life.
Well, that would then depend on the GSM modem that's used in the production device, of course. And yes, it would. But theoretically, since it is using a relatively older standard, it should have a pretty long service life. No problem. Yep.
2 questions, and then we have to continue. So you first, and then over there.
Solar powered? Yeah, it is solar powered. So up here we've got a how strong is the panel?
Say 10 watts.
Yeah, we got a 10 watt panel on it, which I mean it's a low power single board computer. It doesn't actually draw that much power, even when processing, even when using a machine learning model such as TensorFlow Lite, which is what we are looking at. So a solar panel of this size should be able to power it pretty much indefinitely.
Are you going to run the algorithm on that box and then send the data over?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a relatively simple machine. It's audio classification. It's a mostly solved problem, so it's not actually that complex of a machine learning model, but it's good enough for the needs that we need.
And over there?
I'm not sure if I understand it right. The idea is to place the organization along the road?
Yeah, it's ideally between municipalities on like roads out in the field where you have just a few cars moving at a time, so that you can collect data on.
Okay, and your plan is to estimate the direction?
Yes, definitely. That's why we are. That's why we are using 2 separate microphones, because we can use they can be directional microphones, each facing in a different direction. We can use the difference in the intensity to estimate which direction the vehicle is traveling.
Okay, so one is enough. You don't need
It might be. We were thinking that this is the easiest to implement because we don't have to do any sort of very complicated audio processing. This is the solution we went for now.
Okay, with that we have to close the Q&A session for you guys. Thank you very much.